the opportunity to present here our project, present here our work on Contarini, which is a part of our project which is called Center for Renaissance Text at the Palacký University at the Philosophical Faculty, and this project is supported by Czech Ministry of Education, this whole project, and by European Union. So thank you very much for this opportunity to present it here. I would like to apologize because I wanted to have a PowerPoint presentation, but I wanted to prepare it in a train because it was long traveling, 12 hours, but there was no current in the train, and my computer was discharged, so I didn't have time to prepare the PowerPoint presentation, so you will not see any flashing lights and moving pictures and rotating quotations, but you have a handout with text, and I think it's enough. In the first part of my lecture, I would like to answer some general questions. Why, for instance, why I or we have chosen the topic of the immortality, then why Contarini, and actually who was Contarini, because I think he's still unknown thinker, unknown Renaissance thinker. And then in the second part I will turn to the text itself. So why immortality of the soul? Although the question of the immortality of the human soul was discussed by philosophers as early as in the antiquity, it became one of the key philosophical issues only in the late Renaissance. Paul Oskar Christeller explains this accentuation of one's marginal topic by the reference to the Renaissance cult of fame, the endeavor of a Renaissance man to participate in the fame of the ancients, whose work the Renaissance scholars revealed. The cult of fame is closely related to the faith in the human dignity and individualism that transforms into the issue of immortality on the metaphysical level. Thanks to this immortal soul, a man's individual appearance, individual life, and experience live on into the eternity more efficiently than through the fame. These were words of Christeller. The debate on immortality was the central point in the philosophical discourse also in the 16th century, when the famous so-called battle for the soul was started with the publication of the crucial work by Pietro Pomponazzi, De Immortalitate Animae, published in 1516. Pomponazzi examines, as you know, Platonic, Averroistic, Thomistic, and Alexandrist solutions of the problem, and he apparently takes the side of Alexandrists, or better still, he considers the topic philosophically irresolvable, but he regards Alexander's interpretation of Aristotle as the most likely from the philosophical point of view. In Pomponazzi's interpretation of Alexander's theory, the human soul occupying the intermediary position between the heavenly and the earthly must represent a unity and be of only one nature, natura, as it cannot be active without sensual images, with evidences its dependence on the human body, which evidences its dependence on the human body. It is mortal from the absolute point of view, unqualifiedly, simpliciter, but also immortal in certain respects, relatively secundum quid. The wide-ranging discussion with a number of thinkers involved resulted also in a strict separation of philosophical prevailing Aristotelian reasoning on one hand, and theological reasoning based on faith on the other hand. Nevertheless, at the time of the battle for the soul, in the first half of the 16th century, this separation was not so clear. Pomponazzi himself either deems the human soul mortal, with reference to Alexander's interpretation, which represents the only coherent philosophical attitude, according to common sense, or considers the issue to be philosophically irresolvable and takes the side of fideism. This treatise provoked sharp reaction at the time of its publication, which developed into a dispute regarding the relationship between reason and faith, philosophy and religion, and their delimitation. In the Olomouc Center of Renaissance Texts, which is the only institution in the Czech Republic working especially on Renaissance philosophy, the Czech translation of Pomponaci treatise was prepared in the year 2012, and as Paul Richard Bloom, outstanding scholar on Renaissance philosophy, has joined our Olomouc team, we decided to continue working on the topic of the immortality of the soul, and on Renaissance debate about it. Professor Bloom recommended to study a response of one of Pomponaci's opponents, Gaspare Contarini. So that's the first answer why we have chosen the topic of the immortality of the soul. And now, why Contarini? Why Gaspare Contarini? The debate about Pomponaci's approach has different forms, from denunciations, accusations, to more or less scientific discussion. A literary debate started with Contarini's response. But in the modern research, there was not much attention paid to it. Etienne Gilson, in his article on the immortality affair, dedicated to Contarini only a few paragraphs. Contarini's approach was then shortly described in Martin Pine's book on Pomponaci, Radical Philosopher in the Renaissance. Of course, there are some other references, but not important. This is in a sharp contrast with Pomponaci's own estimation of Contarini's response. He praises Contarini's contribution to the debate as the most complete critic possible, and as one of two oppositions in the whole range of critiques, which is worth to react from his point of view. The other one was that of Agostino Nifo, Pomponaci's implacable opponent. Pomponaci himself published Contarini's treatise on the immortality of the soul, together with his own Apologia, already in the year 1518. That means 2 years after publishing the Immortalitate Animae. The copy of the Immortalitate Animae he sent to Contarini by his own. For Contarini asked him not to publish his response, Pomponaci edited it anonymously as Tractatus Contradictoris, with his own answer, with Apologia. And it was republished as a part of Pomponaci's so-called Tractatus Occultissimi in the year 1522, with the same name. That means not mentioning the real author of it. Contarini then replied to Pomponaci's Apologia with the second book of De Immortalitate. Both books were published in his Opera Omnia in Paris only in the year 1571. Because of Pomponaci's high estimation of Contarini's response, and because of the fact that Contarini's contribution to the debate is still unknown, we decided to prepare in Olomouc the modern edition of the Latin text, together with an English and of course Czech translation. So my paper is based on the work on this edition and translation, which is made by Professor Bloom and under the supervision of Professor Bloom, who recently published an article, Gaspare Contarini's response to Pomponaci, a methodic antidote to physicalism of the mind. It was published in in the journal in Hungary. This is the journal of the Hungarian Thomism organization, SITA, so it's not accessible. It's published with other Hungarian articles, but you can read it also in Academia Edu, because Bloom put it on this on this website. So my paper is also based on this on Bloom's contribution in this article. So now, who was Gaspare Contarini? I would like to introduce this author because he's unknown. Contarini was born in 1483 as a member of a noble Venetian family, and he studied in Padua from 1501 till 1509. He was pupil of Pietro Pomponazzi, they made friends, as we can find out from the correspondence and from the works of both authors. From 1509 to 1518, he was a freelance scholar, and then he was in service to the Venetian state, moving from Germany to the Netherlands, England, and Spain. And finally, from 1535 to 1542, he made a career as a churchman, as a cardinal, and he's known as a supporter of the new Jesuit order. Among the most important books belongs Compendium Primae Philosophiae, written in Spain during his Spanish embassy in the year 1527. The edition of, and this is also unknown, this book, but the edition and the translation, the English translation, is being prepared by Andrea Robilio in Leuven, and it will be published together with our edition and translation of Contarini's De Immortalita, two books of De Immortalitate Anime in Leuven in publishing house Peters, I hope next year. Contarini's Opera Omnia consists of 18 different treatises, and there were written certain monographs and articles on Contarini, such as the monograph written by Elizabeth Glenson, which is called Gaspare Contarini, Venice, Rome, and Reform. It was published in the University of California Press, 1993. Or Constance Ferry, Erasmus Contarini and the Religious Republic of Letters, published in Cambridge University Press, 2005. But still, it seems that there remains a lot of unexplored material, especially with regards to his philosophical writings, because these books are more or less historical. So now let's turn to Contarini's contribution to the debate on the immortality of the soul. I will start with Pomponazzi. As it was already mentioned, Pomponazzi, teacher of Contarini, in his treatise on the immortality of the soul, distinguishes four possible positions how to deal with the immortality, and after avoiding Averroes and Platonic position, he analyzes a different view, provided that human nature as a unity could be considered as mortal and as immortal. But with respect to logical principles of contradiction, it is impossible to predicate it simultaneously. Therefore, there are only two acceptable positions. First, that immortal nature is in man unqualifiedly and mortal relatively, or secondly, that mortal is in man unqualifiedly and immortal relatively. Pomponazzi, as you know, identifies the first position with that of Thomas Aquinas, and the second with that of Alexandros of Aphrodisias. According to Pomponazzi, the latter is more philosophical, while the former, Thomas Aquinas, could be considered as correct from the theological point of view. The reason is that Pomponazzi puts forth two criteria by which conceptions of immortality should be judged. Firstly, the propositions must be formed entirely within natural limits, that is, natural reasoning. Secondly, the propositions must be in concord with the thought of Aristotle. You can see it in a quotation from Pomponazi's De Immortalitate Anime. This is from the part where he discusses Saint Thomas' contribution. Now, I quote, now one was that the immortal is in man unqualifiedly, but the mortal relatively. It seems to me that Saint Thomas had stated it more fully and more clearly. I shall refer to his words alone. That it may be understood in orderly fashion, I shall collect his opinion into 5 propositions. So, with respect to these criterions which I have mentioned already, the position of Thomas Aquinas, although it is correct, as Pomponazzi stresses, lacks philosophical relevance. And Pomponazzi divides the position of Aquinas into 5 points and elaborates an extensive critique of it. First, you can see that the intellective and sensitive in man are the same in existence. This is the first point. Secondly, that the soul is truly and unqualifiedly immortal, while relatively mortal, and then the other 3 points, but I will not quote them. They are not important for our problem. But what I would like to stress is the quotation of the second quotation from the Pomponazzi's treatise on the immortality. But what for me is subject to doubt is whether these propositions exceed the natural limits, so that they presuppose something from revelation, and whether they are in conformity with the words of Aristotle, as Saint Thomas himself declares. So these are these 2 criterions. And of the first proposition, then, I have no doubt. This is the proposition that the intellective and sensitive in man are the same in existence. So Pomponazzi doesn't doubt. I have no doubt that in man the sensitive and the intellective are the same in existence, but the other 4 are very doubtful to me, says Pomponazzi. Now I would like to turn to Contarini's response from his Tractatus Contradictoris, so-called Tractatus Contradictoris. Contarini's response to Pomponazzi is often considered as a standard Thomist one. Here could rise a question what standard Thomism is at the beginning of the 16th century. In general, his approach could be considered as Thomist one, provided that Thomas Aquinas defended the immortality of the soul. Yeah, this is the Thomist position. But what is more interesting that Thomism, from that point of view, is the Contarini's attitude to Pomponazzi's way of reasoning. I can quote, knowledge of the immortality, this is already at the beginning of the treatise, knowledge of the immortality of the human soul, I am sure, is attainable through natural reason and can be gathered from Aristotle's teachings. So it's obvious already from the beginning of Contarini's treatise on the immortality that the author completely adopts from his teacher the way how to deal with the topic, these 2 criterions. His thought must fulfill both above mentioned criterions, natural reasoning and the conformity with Aristotle. And he is convinced that the immortality of the souls, which we could name as Thomist conception, could be proved with a fulfillment of both criterions. I can quote again. Two things, however, in my view, natural reason can show effectively about the human intellect. Natural reason. So two things could be solved through natural reasoning. First, that the human intellect cannot possibly be a single one in all humans as ever was thought. The second, that the human soul is unqualifiedly immortal while lacking the immortality of intelligences. And I don't think that Aristotle doubted anyhow about both of theses, whereas I am sure that Aristotle remained much undecided about the other issues which we said natural reason cannot attain except through conjectures. So there are only 2 points, two ideas which could be solved by natural reasoning. The first is so the numerical plurality of humans' intellective souls, and the second, the immortality of the soul. And in the first point, Contarini completely agree with Pomponazzi, who criticizes Averroes' interpretation of Aristotle. But in the second point, that the human soul is unqualifiedly immortal, Contarini disagree with his teacher. Although this position could be considered as Thomist, Contarini stresses that he is not following any authority, not even that of Aristotle. Next quotation. However, science advances not from authority, but from proofs. In other words, we say of someone who agrees to a conclusion, however true, relying on Aristotle or any other authority, that he was a correct opinion, but not that he has any science at all. Therefore, I deem it necessary to abstain now from authorities and to rely only on reasons, which, however, had also been used by ancient philosophers. Only at the end he wants to discuss if conclusions of natural reasoning are conforms with philosopher. Later, again quotation, later we will gather from Aristotle's various writings what he thought about these two theses, which we think that can be proven by natural reason. So it's obvious that Contarini tries not only to adopt Pomponazzi's criteria to be a partner of a dialogue, but even he emphasized philosophical natural reasoning to make his thinking more plausible as a pure philosophical approach. Now we can move to the question how to prove the immortality of the soul according to Contarini. Next quotation. After this clarification, let us return to prove what we left without proof above, namely that material forms are mortal, and then we now prove that the immortal forms, which is being of itself, is simply immortal. So, the fundamental point of Pomponazzi's critiques of the immortality of the soul is the boundness of the process of intellection to do sense perception. Although intellective activity does require an organ of the body, it works with phantasmas derived from sense perception. There is no intellection without a phantasma, according to Pomponazzi. And Pomponazzi said that it's Aristotle's position, and Pomponazzi just repeats it. That means that though intellect does not need body as a subject, as you know, it still needs it as an object, and from this point of view, the unqualified mortality and relative immortality is deduced. Contarini, on contrary to Pomponazzi, makes a crucial point of his critique not the Aristotelian theory of knowledge, but Aristotelian ontology. So the first steps first step is to distinguish between material and immaterial forms, as I showed you in these two quotations, and then to show that material form are mortal because of their connection with body, while immaterial are immortal, for they are being of itself. And the next step is to show that even that human soul is simply unqualifiedly immortal as an immaterial form. The next quotation: we now come to proving our thesis, that is, that the human intellect is unqualifiedly immortal, so that it remains after the decay of the composite of the soul and body. Martin Pine argues that Contarini's way of proving the immortality of the soul is the Thomist reformulation of Aristotelian doctrine of the form. But in my opinion, Contarini still remains in the theory of knowledge, though this theory, of course, has its metaphysical background. For the way how to show the immortality of the intellective soul is, according to Contarini, the analysis of two operations of the human intellective soul, namely understanding and will. This next quotation: two operations are properties of the intellective soul insofar as intellective. The one is to understand, the other, which pertains to that desire that follows the intellect, is to will and to choose. Contarini argues that these two operations as such do not have its foundation in the human body. We have no sensual perception of understanding and will as such. So we have no phantasma of these two operations. That means that the human intellective soul can be considered as a form in itself. So that as the immaterial form. As far as intellect is concerned, immortality hangs upon the operation of the mind, which is immaterial by being non-local, non-extended, atemporal, self-referential, self-sustaining, and self-actuating. Next, Contarini addresses the power of will, which is, as he says, the operation of appetitus in the intellect. He seems to see free will as a condition for immortality, but it also works in the reverse way. Only if the human intellect is immortal, it also can be free, because immortality implies materiality, determination by condition external to the soul, like the body. This is the interpretation of Professor Bloom. And we can say we can see it in the text. Now I say that from both it can be shown that the intellect is unqualifiedly immortal. We begin with understanding and will make use of Aristotle's argument. However, I do not want Aristotle's authority to influence us in any way. We only regard the power of the argument. This is the way how Contarini works with these two Pomponazzi's criterions. So Contarini then elaborates a huge argumentation ordered in a syllogistic style to prove this conclusion. I think, again, it's not necessary to follow it in detail. It would take an hour, maybe more, to follow this argumentation. So let me turn to another aspect of his treatise, which I have already mentioned, and which is stressed later on in the second book on the immortality of the soul, in the Contarini second book. So I'm speaking about the relation between reason and faith, which was recently underlined by Paul Richard Bloom as a fundamental aspect in Contarini's contribution. This is in this article of Bloom. Pomponazzi does not agree with Pomponazzi. Contarini does not agree with Pomponazzi's fideism and skepticism. The immortality of the soul is not an article of faith. If it would be, it would not have any sense to deal with it philosophically. In the first quotation, Contarini says, having reached this point in the discussion, in my view, this demonstrated immortality of the soul is surrounded by many implications which natural reason cannot achieve to demonstrate, but can only make central conjectures in treating them, such as to the state of the soul after death and whether or not they precede the bodies, of which they are the souls. I believe those cannot be demonstrated by natural reason. I will speak about it, something about it later. And the next quotation, this is very important. However, all our research would be in vain if the immortality of the soul were an article of faith, as Your Excellency says, that's Pomponazzi. For the natural light of man does not achieve to prove articles of faith. Rather, they are only known through the supernatural light. So, Contarini argues that there are some other issues concerning the intellective soul which are not attainable by natural reasoning. Philosophy can prove that the human intellect is immortal, but it wavers with regard to the state of the souls after death, and etc. This must be perfected not by natural but by supernatural light, which is in fundamental agreement with a natural soul. And this is this Pomponazzi repeats many times this argumentation, and especially in the second book on the immortality of the soul, it's again underlined. You can see in the next quotation. Then you say that our claim, namely that it can be proven with natural reason that the soul is immortal, is against faith, because from there resurrection could be proven. So also St. Thomas, Augustine, and almost all Christians who affirm that would have spoken against faith. Quite astonishing. On the contrary, we hold that it is most consonant with faith, which processes the supernatural light to be not in contrast with the natural light, but to be the reparation, in a sense, of the deficiency of the natural light. Hence, it is highly consonant with faith that what was begun by natural light, but could not be completed, is perfected through the supernatural light of faith. Since, then, natural light proves that the soul is immortal, but is faltering regarding the status of the souls after death and unable to adduce something certain, it is most congruent that this is brought to perfection by the supernatural light, and so on. To sum up, I would like to underline again 2 points in Contarini's contribution to the problem of the immortality of the soul. First, Contarini adopts Pomponazzi's criterions and aims to deal with the problem only within borders of natural reason. In this approach, he doesn't want to follow any authority, for instance, Thomas Aquinas, and even not that of Aristotle, although his argumentation is based on Aristotle, of course. This argumentation can be considered as Aristotelian. It is not because of the authority of Aristotle, but because of the strongness of the argumentation, of Aristotle's argumentation. And I found this methodological principle very important, although in fact his argumentation is Aristotelian and from certain aspects Thomist in general, more specifically with respect to the conception of the material and immaterial forms. And the second point, which is worth to stress, is Contarini's theory on the relation between reason and faith. Contarini, and I quote, no, this is not quotation, Contarini will refer to the truth of reason and that of faith as a relation of perfection to the effect that faith confirms and makes even more plausible what natural reason has found on its own. Yeah, this is a quotation from Bloom. Contarini is stretching the scientific imagination because he implies that science can lead to further fields of investigation that are valid in some way and yet require some transition to a different method or to different source of verification. This is Bloom's interpretation, which we, well, this is the result of our work on Contarini. The background for this view can be found in the thought of Thomas Aquinas again, in Thomistic relation between natural and supernatural, when supernatural does not cancel natural. This is Thomistic view of Thomas Aquinas. But Contarini's contribution, which is a sharp attack on fideism, it is newly elaborated, and it can be put also in the context of that time, which is the debate about the Reformation in which Contarini participated as well. So in my opinion, a more complex study of Contarini's philosophical, theological and political thought is needed. And I hope that our work on Contarini's De Immortalitate, together with Robilio's work, will contribute to the future research. And this is also why we open a panel dedicated to Contarini at the meeting of the Renaissance Society of America, which will be in 3 weeks. Thank you for your attention.